Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords, and today I was going to talk about the debate that has been going on in some areas of social media in the OSR about the so-called Mythic dungeon versus the, I guess you could say the organized dungeon, or some people would say Gygaxian naturalism. But before I say that, before I get into that topic, I wanted to mention that if you haven't watched my latest short, that would have come out the day before this comes out, I think, and you're a Meatball fan, you really should, because it just so happens as I was doing that short, which is about the fact that there is no character sheet in the new D&D book, the new Blair's Handbook, I mean, which is proof, I think, that they're done with tabletop, isn't it? But anyways, Meatball does a very athletic jump for a 14-and-a-half-year-old cat, so all Meatball fans be on the watch. I have no idea if she's going to show up to this video. She comes as she pleases. When I do a short, I'll often point it right at her, so then you get more Meatball coverage. All right. So you've got these groups of old school gamers. And in particular, a lot of this comes down to the Bro SR people who are a cult that want to create a their false version of a golden age where clearly the people who had created the earliest editions of D&D were all knowing and all seeing, and everything they did had a purpose and a plan, right? So they have labeled something as a mythic dungeon, or as the dungeon as the underworld, in some very pretentious essay writing to justify why in very early D&D editions and adventures, the generators that were available for making, the random tables and processes for making dungeons would end up producing these dungeons that really made no sense, okay? Because you would have sometimes, for example, a 10 by 10 room that had a dragon in it. The dragon couldn't go out the door, right? Or whatever. Stuff like that, right? There's a room, maybe you have a 100 by 100 room and it's got two giants, and that's fine, but the doors are 10 foot wide and the corridors are 10 foot, and those giants could never actually get out of there, right? Not to mention that, so it's got this random assortment, right, of monsters and creatures. And the AD&D 1E dungeon generator, the one in the Dungeon Master's Guide, pretty much works at that level. It's a bit more sophisticated than slightly earlier ones that came out earlier in the 70s, but it's still fundamentally is part of an obvious sign of a process of learning about how to do these things. Okay, because as much as we might say that RPGs are not something that necessarily become more advanced in later editions or things like that, or that they become more that like, an RPG product made in 1999 is not going to automatically be better than one made in 1981, unlike, say, a computer made in 1999 versus one in 1981, where there will obviously be improvements, right? However, there are things that people went along learning about RPGs, and that were not automatically there right from the beginning. And so some of these things were done in better ways. They were more craftfully created than in some of the earlier ones. So people did learn some things, not so much about, because it's not that they were, dice pool games are not better than D20 games, obviously, but some of the elements of design and construction, and even things like writing and layout, improved over time. And one of the things that improves over time is the way people think about the dungeon, and about setting and genre and the context between these things and system. So, in essence, you have this group, the Broasar, mainly the Broasar, and some of the other kind of ultra old school fundamentalist OSR people, who have this problem that they want to pretend that what they're doing is the best, most perfect version, the most ideal form of D&D, the best that has ever been and could ever be, and therefore everything it does has to have this immense, almost spiritual purpose to it that is better than any other version of the game, right? So they are trying to argue that these dungeons that get randomly generated, what they actually are is this work of genius, of the divine spirit landing on Gary Gygax and inspiring him to create perfection. Because even though it looks like they're a bunch of just random stuff mashed together in a very clumsy design, what they actually are meant to represent is the mythic underworld. It's actually that dungeons don't have to be realistic. And there they will then criticize who? Gary Gygax, because later on, as Gary Gygax got better at this stuff, he started making dungeons that had some logic to them, right? Where you had like groups of monsters in certain areas, where you have a certain kind of explanation of why the dungeon has creatures in it and how those creatures live, and stuff like that. And that tends to be called Gygaxian naturalism, you know. So they're actually now claiming that in fact, was Gygax losing his way. He has fallen as the prophet now because he's no longer useful to Jeffro Johnson and his gang of anti-Semites. So instead, he is now the fallen, devalued prophet who has turned away from the perfect form of the mythic underworld by trying to explain how things work. And to them, the mythic underworld, what they're trying to appeal there to, of course, is myth, right, and legend. And now you're stepping on my territory, mother. Sorry, I'm not going to say that because YouTube might demonetize me. But you're stepping on my territory there because you're trying to claim the mythic underworld, that the dungeon is a representation of the mythic underworld. Now, the underworld is something that has been a part of human myth and mythology and religion basically since the dawn of time, right? It's one of the earliest things. If you look at the model of shamanism, the most primitive, like the primitive tribal religion of the witch doctor or the medicine man or the, you know, what have you, the underworld is there. It's already a part of it. It's one of the first things in human consciousness that appears in myth, right? It's the underworld and the upper world. This is ancient stuff. And of course, in the classical period of several civilizations, you end up getting detailed explanations of the mythic underworld. And the mythic underworld is basically a combination of the land of the dead and the place where there are monsters and the demonic world, the lower world, as opposed to the upper world. It's the contrast, the above and below contrast of the heavenly worlds above and the underworld below. And the underworld is a place of darkness and danger, a place of the dead, a place of lost things. And all of this is very interesting. But I'll tell you what it isn't. First of all, it isn't dungeon corridors. The underworld, part of the point of the underworld is that it's savage nature, okay? So if you want a mythic underworld generator, I have it right here in Arrows of Indra. I did a very complex, there's an entire chapter that lets you generate cavern complexes of the 8 realms of the Patala underworld, which is the version of the underworld in Indian mythology, right? There are 8 infinitely large realms, cave complexes. Some of these caves are tiny. Some of them are large enough as the island of Manhattan or something like that. Some of them have cities inside of them. They have terrible monsters and all kinds of things. And these are all creatures, and each level has its own theme. And they're all creatures that relate to the let's say spiritual underworld of the pre-Hindu Indian mythological concepts. Okay? That would be a mythic underworld. That is a mythic underworld. A dungeon that is randomly generated with D&D monsters and has like traps and treasures and you're just rolling at random and getting monsters and items and treasure at random would not be a mythic underworld. Okay, that's not. What you have there is just, what you could say is you just have a dungeon contest. That's what it is. It's or a contest dungeon if you prefer. Right? Because that was the original purpose of that. Okay, the problem is it's not exciting enough for the guys that want to pretend that AD&D First Edition was the apogee of all gaming and is the perfect model that all must obey. It's not enough for them to just say the truth. They have to invent that it is somehow the ideal, platonic perfection of the gaming experience when it actually isn't. What it actually was is that in very early D&D, you made the dungeon, and it was pretty random because it didn't really matter, because it was a game where there was not enough yet of a necessary conception of things like setting and of internal coherence of a world, because it was still coming out of a kind of a wargaming tradition, and because people hadn't thought about it enough, and because there's also nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? The dungeon crawl is its own thing. You can play a campaign that's just going into the dungeon and you're not doing anything else, and that's what a lot of early campaigns did, And there, it doesn't have to make a lot of sense, because there is another place where you can put dungeons that don't make a lot of sense in a Gonzo context, right? Now, ironically, I've got in here a dungeon generator as well, which is one that allows you to create the underground complexes of the ancients that exist in the world of the Last Sun. But that one is actually a Gygaxian naturalist generator, right? Because it's supposed to make sense. It's part of the, my Gonzo settings are Gonzo, but there's always a reason for what's there, right? So there's a lot of weird stuff in those dungeons, but they're dungeons that still make sense. They're actually not a mythic underworld, nor are they a nonsense, just a contest dungeon, okay? But yeah, the fundamentally, if you want to make a dungeon, you need to think, first of all, about your campaign, right? And think about, in your campaign, what do you care to do, right? Because if you want your game to be serious and emulative, you have to do one thing. If you want your game to be fun and you don't really care about the setting very much, the setting is mostly a backdrop for just adventure, action, fighting, or things like that, then you can do whatever you want. Then you can do a contest dungeon. But don't pretend that you're going into the mythic underworld and that you're like, you're goddamn Joseph Campbell or something, analyzing a dungeon that has a randomly generated nest of giant rats next to a randomly generated rust monster next to a randomly generated dragon, right? That is not the mythic journey, right? That isn't the descent into the underworld, right? It's not the Orphic mysteries that you're undertaking there. But you can do it, right? That's fine. If you want, if you're running a game that is in fact mythic, or that is meant to be from a culture that was evocative of myth, there you might actually want to make a real mythic dungeon. But that is not to just randomly generate a bunch of things and then say, oh, yeah, this is, that doesn't make any sense because it's symbolic, right? So in Dark Albion, here's the reason I brought this one out, is there are several sample dungeons in the Dark Albion book. Even though obviously Albion is not a setting where the idea is your character is going to be spending a majority of their time in a dungeon. There's a lot more overland adventuring and political intrigues and mass combat battles and other things, city adventures. So, it's not exactly as a setting. It's not one where like all the action happens in a dungeon. But we presented, myself and Dominic Crusade, the publisher, presented a few different types of possible dungeons that are medieval authentic, right? So there was one that is an ancient tomb, right? There's another one that is some old catacombs. There is another one, which is the one that I would call the mythic one in this case, which is a goblin cave, a goblin warren, right? And so again, it's a cave, that imagery of the cave, because it is not anything that is made by man loses the quality of the underworld. The underworld is the dark thing, the thing in the dark that man fears, right? So it is not something made, but as soon as there's a difference between walking down a corridor and walking into a tunnel of rock, right? That is a total change in terms of the feeling of security relative, because you could be worried in both, right? But in one, you're dealing with something made by man. In the other, you're dealing by something made by an entity you're not aware of. Okay, so it's different, right? Made by the gods or made by demons or what have you, right? And the goblins are presented in this context, in the Albion setting. Goblins are not a Gygaxian naturalist. They're not a race of creatures that are like a type of humans, right? Like you see nowadays in 5th edition, where all the demi-humans are basically like just substitute humans, right? They are like all of the non-human races in Albion or in Sword and Caravan or in Baptism of Fire. They are these alien entities that are generally some form of metaphor for part of the human condition, in the sense that you see in myth, creatures that aren't human are meant to be metaphors for the human condition of some kind, right? And so these goblins in the dungeon in question, they emerge from this kind of black hole, right? They're not, it's not that there's baby goblins for you to kill like there is in the Caves of Chaos, right? That's Gygaxian naturalism, right? This is a mythic dungeon, right? So there's treasure to find, there are monsters to slay, there is a darkness to oppose, and it is all thematic to a reason, to a metaphor, to a concept, right? It's not random. It's not just, here are a bunch of random monsters, and then there's treasure, and your point is to just get the treasure and become rich. That's not the point, in fact. In Albion, that's almost never the point. But in that dungeon, including, even though there is some treasure, the point isn't to get the treasure. The point is to end the evil, okay? And that's one of the essential parts, let's say, of the mythic dungeon. It is that the point has to be something bigger than I'm going to try to get out of 2,000 gold pieces, okay? So there you go. As it happens, I make mythic dungeons, right? Gary Gygax made Gygaxian naturalist dungeons once he got the hang of it. And before that, he made these kind of nonsense contest dungeons. And none of it is indicative of the pseudo-history and quasi-religion of the Bro SR. So I guess that's everything I had to say for today. If you like this video, please hit the like button, share, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Send us anywhere that you think people will like it, or that you think people, especially bros, will be pissed off. And if you like my style, you should definitely check out all of my products. There's links in the description below. My latest product is my newest issue of the Pundit Files, which came out on Tuesday, and it is space opera planet generator, but it is also the first sneak preview of my Star Adventurer setting, Sons of Heaven. So this is a set of generators for creating solar systems and specific planets and having stuff in it, but it is set in the context of this setting that I'm trying to make for Star Adventurer, which is essentially the Bronze Age collapse in space. And so it is, in a way, me trying to cheat by using some of the historical, authentic stuff in there. But what that means is the worlds that you create, if you use this particular space generator, are meant to be areas that were once part of a great space confederation that are now that have now been devastated, and little pockets of civilization exist. Some places are ruins. Some places have new problems, and so you basically would use it in a campaign where you're traveling around from system to system, either trying to find riches to plunder, or to try to restore the ancient human confederation, or other stuff like that. You know, that you're exploring the ruins of a once great interstellar civilization that was crushed by a terrible galactic war. And that's the theme in Sons of Heaven, is the collapse and then perhaps the restoration. So be sure to check that out. It's only available at the Red Room store, and as usual, it only costs $3.50. So if you can get someone to give you $3.50, you can pick up an issue of the Pundit Files, either that one or any of the 19 or the 18 other previous ones, all of which are very much worthwhile. And while you're at it, don't forget to check out my other products. Like, again, if you actually would like the idea of Mythic role-playing, Arrows of Indra is a great way to go. And of course, stuff like my Dark Albion book, and also Baptism of Fire, my newest medieval authentic RPG, which is full of mythological stuff, though not really dungeons as such. But hey, we did also bring out the Pundit Files issue on the cosmic world tree of the Slavs, which is very different than, well, similar but different to the more famous Viking Yggdrasil. So you might want to check that out too. Anyways, that's everything for today. Currently smoking this beautiful Lorenzetti egg plus Argento roots.